it's not looking great still for Zelensky, is it, when it comes to the White House?
Yes, I think every time that the Ukrainians and the European allies think that they've got Donald Trump lined up about where America should be, which is supporting Ukraine, a democracy fighting tyranny and also protecting its sovereign borders, Trump seems to speak to Putin and then revert to type, which is basically not to appear to be have an ethical view, if you like, on this conflict, to see it in terms of his own interests and ego. And obviously, at the moment, in terms of supposedly winning the Nobel Peace Prize. But I think what's striking about this particular incident is that certainly last week we were led to understand here that Zelensky had made significant progress with the American government and with Trump in terms of threatening to supply them with Tomahawk long-range missiles, which would have helped bring Russia to the negotiating table, and seems to have backtracked completely on that after he spoke to Putin. So you have to wonder, what was in that conversation with Putin?
Yeah, it did follow on from that, didn't it? What's your sense about Trump really understanding what has happened to Ukraine here in terms of land?
As I say, I don't think Trump sees Ukraine conflict through any kind of democratic or international legal focus, but rather through America's sort of, in his own naked interests, and his own ego. And I think that's the problem, that he's not committed to an independent and sovereign Ukraine, doesn't seem to understand or care that allowing Putin and Russia to get away with a land grab in Ukraine is actually setting a terrible precedent for the rest of the world. And I think you have to look at another claim that Putin apparently has made to Trump, which Trump has swallowed whole, which is that the Russians are making significant gains on the battlefield. Now, that certainly doesn't match up with anything I've seen. In fact, last week, the MOD here issued a bulletin saying essentially that the Russians had lost 330,000 men killed and wounded so far this year.
This
for an
year
absolutely incremental gain in land.
Let me linger on that. 330,000 this year alone.
Yes, killed and wounded,
wow.
And a total of 1.2 million killed and wounded since the invasion began. And when you look at, they haven't taken a major city, they have actually got less land than they had 3 years ago, the Russians, in Ukraine. That, by any standards, is a catastrophe. And for Trump to swallow the line that Putin has apparently been spouting, and you see it in the Russian media, that Russia's on the verge of some great breakthrough. Everything I'm seeing and hearing just doesn't confirm that. In fact, what it tells you is that there's a stalemate, an area of about 20 kilometres around the front line, which is a complete kill zone because it's covered in drones and nobody can make any advances in that area. So this is also a conundrum for me to understand.
With Donald Trump, it's often hard, isn't it, to know whether what you're hearing publicly or even reports of shouting matches in the Oval Office, it's difficult to know whether what you're hearing is what he really thinks or whether it's some kind of play. Some people say, we saw it in Gaza where he started talking about the Riviera, and then sometime later, not that long later, up comes the actual, apparently workable Trump peace plan that did get the remaining live hostages out. And it's far from clear whether peace is going to be achieved there. But there was certainly some success achieved from the Israeli perspective and from the perspective of Palestinians who wanted the fighting to stop. Is it possible that some of that is going on here? Or is it just impossible to tell whether there's some public showboating, but very different things happening behind the scenes?
I think anything's possible, although I think attaching too much rationality to what Trump is doing is probably a mistake. The fact is, again, and it was said recently by the retiring head of MI6, Richard Moore, there is absolutely no sign that the Russians are prepared to make any kind of concessions, either on the battlefield or otherwise, to bring this war to an end. They haven't agreed to a ceasefire. They haven't agreed to a direct meeting between Putin and Zelensky, the two sides, which is necessary further to be progress. And they just don't seem to be interested seriously in bringing the war to an end, as I say. And in fact, they're playing the Americans and playing Trump because every time Putin either meets with him in a summit or has a long phone call with him, all that is doing effectively is cementing Putin's position within Russia and also internationally. I mean, in this case, where they're going to meet in Budapest in an EU country, Putin is, after all, an indicted war criminal under the ICC, and yet he's managing to come onto European soil for this meeting. All of this is politically very significant inside Russia in terms of cementing his autocracy there.
What about the relationship between the Trumps, not just Donald Trump, but the Trumps and Putin? Because Melania Trump has been speaking very favourably about him recently, hasn't she, in private exchanges that she's had with him over the release of some of the children, Ukrainian children who've been taken into Russia, a handful brought back home. The relationship between the three of them is odd, isn't it? It's hard to read. You know, they just seem that when Donald Trump in particular talks about, oh, he's let me down, I'm disappointed in Putin. Again, I have no idea what to make of things when he says that.
I think you have to look at Trump's actions rather than his words. I think that's the essential point here. And those of us who believe and have believed for many years that Putin has some kind of leverage over Trump, I'm afraid, are sort of been borne out, I think, by Trump's actual behaviour. I mean, if you look at the exchange in the Oval Office back in February, if this report in the FT and other places is true of what transpired last week between them, then we're back 180 degrees at that same point, where he's basically saying that Zelensky has to surrender and allow Putin to take over 20-25% of his country, including parts of the country, actually, that the Ukrainians have fought for very heavily, and they haven't conceded. So I think that yes, there is a complicated relationship there. I actually think Melania has been quite critical of Putin and has put the spotlight on the thing that he was actually indicted for as a war criminal under the ICC.
The children.
The kidnapping of children. And that she takes a different view of this from Trump, from what we always see. And that in itself is probably because she comes from Eastern Europe and has a better idea of what Russia's really like to deal with than Trump himself does.
And let's talk briefly, you touched on it a moment ago, about internal politics in Russia, as well as the Ukraine situation. I mean, all the evidence suggests he's been carrying out for a long time now on the Russian population a kind of North Korean style exercise of control. Is that how you would describe it?
I don't think it's quite that brutal yet, although certainly a lot of people have died and fallen out of windows and the like when they've opposed him. And of course, we had his main political opponent, Navalny, die in prison in very suspicious circumstances, shall we say, at the very least. So I think that Russia has become a much more autocratic country, more of a dictatorship than an authoritarian state, less plural and there's less life really in any Russian politics. But what is key here is the fact that in order to con his people that this war has been worthwhile and that they will get something out of it, Putin has to persuade them that he's not a pariah on the international stage, that he can go head-to-head with the most powerful leaders in the world as an equal. And that's exactly what this summit process is doing. And of course, at Alaska, there was absolutely no solid outcome of that other than Putin gaining his prestige and his legitimacy, I would argue, inside Russia itself, particularly in the elite who have been most put out, and a lot of them are opposed to this war, which they see as overreach.
And you mentioned Alaska there and this upcoming summit in Budapest. There's very little the rest of the world can do if Trump decides to give him this stage, isn't there?
I'm not sure there's very little. I mean, I think it's incumbent upon NATO allies and European states and so on to make clear their views on this and to make clear their views on the indictment of Putin, and they won't have him on their soil. I actually believe firmly that there will be no just peace or lasting peace in Ukraine for as long as Putin's in office. I've said this many times, and that's based upon the fact that this is a key part of his legacy. And he doesn't seem to care how many men or material he loses for very small incremental gains against Ukraine. It's an obsession of his, of Putin's. So I think the whole process of these summits is probably a waste of time and playing very much into Russia's agenda, which is to play this long and to take prestige over being a negotiator with the big boys at the table.